Cassandra Brooks froze mid-step, her designer heels clicking to a stop on the diner's worn linoleum. Her daughter Ivy sat rigid at the corner table, small hands trembling as she tried to order, mouth opening and closing without sound. The waitress smiled awkwardly, uncertain. Then a man in a faded apron appeared, calloused hands moving in fluid gestures that made Ivy's eyes widen. Sign language. Perfect natural sign language from a stranger in a roadside diner. Ivy's face lit up for the first time in months, fingers flying in response. Cassandra's breath caught. Who was this man? And why did his eyes hold the same deep sadness she saw in her daughter's mirror every morning? What she discovered next would shatter everything she thought she knew about being a mother. The morning shift at Riverside Diner always started the same way for Garrett Walsh. 5 o'clock, when the sky still held on to darkness like a secret. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he moved between tables, his reflection ghosting across windows that looked out onto empty streets. His hands worked automatically, wiping down surfaces already clean, arranging salt shakers that didn't need arranging. It was the ritual that kept him going, the rhythm that told him he was still here, still moving forward. In the pocket of his faded apron, pressed against his chest, was a photograph worn soft at the edges. He didn't need to look at it to see every detail. Rosie at 7 years old, gap-toothed smile bright as summer, her small hands frozen mid-sign, telling him, "I love you, Daddy," in the language they'd created together. The language he'd taught himself from library books and YouTube videos at 2 in the morning, after shifts that left his feet aching. The language that had become his whole world for 8 years, until the day her heart had simply stopped beating in his arms. That was 2 years ago. Some mornings it felt like 2 lifetimes. Other mornings it felt like yesterday. Garrett paused at the corner table by the window, the booth where he used to sit with Rosie every Sunday morning. She'd order pancakes with strawberries, and he'd practice new signs with her, their hands dancing in soft morning light. Now the table sat empty most days, a quiet space that other customers seemed to instinctively avoid, as if they could sense the weight of memory. "You're doing it again." Helen's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle but firm. The diner's owner stood behind the counter, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, weathered hands already working on the first pot of coffee. She'd owned Riverside Diner for 30 years, had hired Garrett when he'd shown up desperate and broken, a single father with a sick child and medical bills that made his hands shake. She'd never asked questions, never pushed. She'd just given him steady hours and quiet understanding. Garrett's hands had been moving without his knowledge, muscle memory taking over. His fingers had traced out the sign for "Good morning" in empty air, followed by "I miss you," a gesture so automatic now that he barely noticed. He dropped his hands quickly, shoving them into his apron pockets. Helen poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the counter. Thinking or remembering? She studied him with eyes that had seen too much of life. There's a difference. One keeps you stuck. The other helps you heal. He did know that. In those last hours, when hospital machines had beeped their final warnings, Rosie had looked up at him with huge brown eyes and signed with trembling fingers, "Don't be sad forever, Daddy. Promise." He'd promised. He'd lied. Because how could he move forward when every breath felt like betrayal, when every moment of happiness was crushed by guilt that she'd never have another moment at all? The morning rush started at 6:30, a trickle that became a stream of regulars and construction workers and nurses ending night shifts. By 11 o'clock, the breakfast crowd had thinned to almost nothing. The lunch rush wouldn't start for another hour. The diner settled into quiet emptiness that Garrett had learned to appreciate. It was in these moments that he felt closest to Rosie, when the world slowed enough that he could almost hear her laughter, almost see her small form bouncing in the corner booth. He was wiping down the counter when he heard it, the distinctive purr of an expensive engine, out of place in this neighborhood of pickup trucks and decade-old sedans. Through the window, he watched a black Mercedes pull into the parking lot, sleek lines and glossy paint practically screaming money. The car looked like it had taken a wrong turn, ended up in the wrong part of town where buildings leaned tired against each other and sidewalks were more crack than concrete. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. Even from a distance, Garrett could see she belonged to a different world. Black suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, heels clicking with authority, dark hair pulled back in a style that meant business. She moved around the car to open the passenger door, and a child emerged. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark curls catching sunlight and eyes that seemed too old for her young face. The woman placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her toward the diner entrance. There was something careful in the gesture, something protective that Garrett recognized. It was the way he used to guide Rosie through crowds, always aware of her vulnerability, always ready to shield her from a world that didn't always know how to be kind. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Helen glanced up from the register, eyebrows rising slightly at the obvious mismatch between these customers and their usual clientele, but her smile remained warm. "Sit anywhere you like, hon." The woman surveyed the diner with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind of gaze that probably evaluated quarterly reports with equal precision. For a moment, Garrett thought she might turn around and leave. But then the little girl tugged on her sleeve, pointing toward the window, toward the corner booth, toward Rosie's table. Something twisted in Garrett's chest, a mix of territorial protectiveness and irrational grief. That was their spot, his and Rosie's. But before he could process the feeling, the woman was already guiding her daughter that direction, settling into the booth with practiced efficiency. Garrett took a breath, forced his professional smile into place, and walked over with 2 menus. Up close, he could see the woman more clearly. Late 30s, sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes that catalogued everything. But there were shadows under those eyes, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights and worries that followed you into dawn. "Welcome to Riverside Diner," Garrett said, setting down the menus. "Can I start you ladies off with something to drink?" The woman looked up, and he saw her really register him for the first time. Her eyes flickered across his face, his worn apron, his calloused hands, and he could practically see her filing him away under "service worker, not important." It was a look he'd gotten used to over the years. Coffee. Black. And she turned to her daughter with a softness that transformed her entire face. "Ivy, honey, what would you like?" "Honey, what?" The little girl, Ivy, looked up at her mother, then down at the table. Her hands moved slightly, a tentative gesture that Garrett recognized instantly, his heart stopping mid-beat. She was trying to communicate. Her mouth opened, closed, frustration flickering across her young face. No sound emerged. The mother watched with infinite patience, but Garrett could see the helplessness in her eyes, the desperate wish to understand. "Orange juice?" she offered gently. "Or milk?" Ivy's hands moved again, more insistent, but the gestures were incomplete, uncertain. Garrett felt his feet carrying him forward before his brain caught up. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to protect the fragile walls he'd built around his grief. But Ivy's frustrated eyes, the way her small hands trembled as she tried to make herself understood, the echo of every time Rosie had faced this same struggle. He knelt down beside the booth, bringing himself to Ivy's eye level. The movement was automatic, born from years of communicating with his own daughter. His hands came up, moving through space with a fluidity that felt like coming home. "Hi," he signed, his fingers forming the simple greeting. "My name is Garrett. What would you like to eat?" The change in Ivy was instantaneous and devastating. Her eyes went wide, her whole body seeming to light up from the inside. Her mother sucked in a sharp breath, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Ivy's hands flew into motion with a joy that made Garrett's throat tight. "Pancakes," she signed, the gesture exuberant and clear. "With strawberries." Garrett felt his lips curve into the first real smile he'd worn in months. "With whipped cream?" He signed back, and Ivy nodded so enthusiastically her curls bounced. "Yes, lots of whipped cream. And can I have chocolate chips, too? Please?" The conversation flowed naturally, his hands remembering patterns he'd thought were locked away forever. It felt right. It felt like breathing. He stood up, finally meeting the mother's eyes, and found her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Shock, certainly. Disbelief. But underneath, something else. Something that looked almost like hope wrapped in desperation. "You." Her voice cracked slightly, and she cleared her throat. "You know sign language?" It wasn't a question, but Garrett nodded anyway. "Yes, Mom. I learned it a while back. Ivy wants pancakes with strawberries, whipped cream, and chocolate chips, if that's all right with you." The woman set down her coffee cup with a hand that shook slightly. That's fine. Perfect. Whatever she wants." She was still staring at him like he'd performed some kind of miracle, like he'd spoken in tongues instead of simply using his hands. But Garrett saw it all anyway. Saw the exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind that came from trying to be everything to everyone and failing. Saw the love she had for her daughter, fierce and protective, and not quite enough to bridge the communication gap between them. Saw the guilt that ate at her. "It takes time," he said quietly. "But the fact that you're trying is what matters." He turned to Ivy, whose eyes hadn't left him. "One order of special pancakes coming right up." He signed, and was rewarded with a smile that could have powered the sun. As he walked back toward the kitchen, he felt the mother's eyes on his back, heavy with questions she didn't know how to ask. Helen was waiting by the service window, her knowing gaze tracking his every movement. "Well," she said softly, "that was something." Garrett wanted to argue, to say it wasn't like that, to maintain the walls that kept him safe. But he couldn't. Because for just a moment, signing with Ivy, he'd felt something other than hollow ache. He'd felt useful. He'd felt like maybe all those hours of learning sign language hadn't died with Rosie. In the booth by the window, Cassandra Brooks sat frozen, her untouched coffee growing cold. She watched her daughter, really watched her, in a way she hadn't had time to do in months. Ivy was bouncing slightly in her seat, hands moving in small, excited gestures as she looked toward the kitchen. The waiter. The man who'd just done something Cassandra had been trying and failing to do for 2 years. Her phone buzzed. Another email, another crisis, another meeting that couldn't wait. She ignored it. For once, she ignored it. The food arrived, delivered by the same man whose name tag read Garrett in faded letters. He set down Cassandra's coffee, fresh and hot, without her having to ask. Then he placed Ivy's pancakes in front of her with a flourish that made the little girl giggle silently. The pancakes were enormous, covered in strawberries and whipped cream and chocolate chips. Today, Cassandra said nothing. Today she watched her daughter's face light up with pure joy and felt something crack inside her chest. "Enjoy," Garrett said, but he was signing as he spoke, his hands moving for Ivy's benefit. He started to turn away, and Cassandra found herself speaking before she'd thought it through. "Wait, please, How do you know sign language, if you don't mind me asking?" She was aware she was overstepping, being too personal with someone who was essentially a stranger. Garrett's expression shuttered, the warmth from moments ago disappearing behind a wall of careful neutrality. "I learned it a while back," he said, the words clipped and distant. "For someone who needed it." That was all. No explanation, no story, no opening for further questions. She pulled out her phone and did what she always did when presented with a puzzle. She started gathering information. The diner's name was embossed on the menu. Riverside Diner. A quick search showed it had been owned by the same family for 3 decades. No website, barely any online presence, just a handful of reviews praising the coffee. Nothing about a waiter who knew sign language. Ivy tapped her mother's hand, signing clumsily. "Good. Happy." Her face was smeared with whipped cream, her eyes bright with contentment, and Cassandra felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She was CEO of TechBridge Solutions, a company she'd built from the ground up, employing 3,000 people with a market value in the billions. She'd given keynote speeches on leadership, been featured in major magazines, been called one of the most influential women in technology. But she couldn't communicate with her own daughter. The irony wasn't lost on her. Neither was the shame. Cassandra had always prided herself on her problem-solving abilities, her capacity to tackle challenges head-on. But when it came to Ivy, when it came to learning sign language fluently enough to really connect, she'd failed. She watched as Garrett returned to check on other tables, his movements efficient and practiced. He didn't look their way, didn't acknowledge them beyond professional courtesy. But Ivy's eyes followed him around the room, a longing in her expression that made Cassandra's chest ache. Her daughter wanted connection, craved it, and Cassandra, for all her power and resources, couldn't give it to her. But this man, this stranger, had offered it freely in a matter of minutes. "We should come back," Cassandra signed to Ivy, the gestures clumsy but earnest. "Next week. Would you like that?" Ivy's response was immediate and enthusiastic, her small hands flying in agreement. Cassandra made a decision then, one that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. She would come back. She would figure out this man's story. And somehow she would find a way to give Ivy what she so desperately needed, even if it meant swallowing her pride and asking a stranger for help. As they left the diner an hour later, Ivy turned back at the door, waving at Garrett, who was clearing their table. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, and waved back. Then, with a gentleness that made Cassandra's breath catch, he signed, "See you soon." Ivy's face broke into another radiant smile, and she signed back enthusiastically. "Promise?" Garrett's hand hesitated in the air, and for a moment Cassandra thought he might not respond. But then his fingers moved, slow and deliberate. "Promise." One word, one sign. But in it, Cassandra heard the echo of something deeper, something that spoke of loss and longing and a willingness to open doors he'd thought were closed forever. In the Mercedes, Ivy wouldn't stop signing about the pancakes, the nice man. Tuesday arrived with the certainty of dawn, and with it came the black Mercedes pulling into the parking lot at precisely 11:15. Garrett saw it through the window and felt his stomach drop. He'd told himself she wouldn't come back, that the encounter had been a one-time thing. He'd been wrong. Ivy bounded out of the passenger side, her face breaking into a brilliant smile when she spotted Garrett through the window. She made a beeline for the corner booth, claiming it like it belonged to her. In a way that made Garrett's chest tight, she looked right at home there. Cassandra approached him directly, bypassing the usual pretense. Up close, he could see she'd dressed down, trading the power suit for dark jeans and a simple blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. "I have a proposition for you," she said, her voice low. "I'd like to hire you as a sign language tutor. For me. I've been trying to learn for 2 years, and I'm failing. Ivy needs someone who can communicate with her fluently, and more importantly, I need to be that person." She paused. I'm willing to pay whatever your rate is." But before he could speak, Ivy appeared at her mother's side. Her hands moved in a flurry of signs, too fast for her mother to follow, frustration already creeping into her expression. "Slow down, honey," Cassandra said gently, but the words were useless without the signs. Ivy turned to Garrett instead, and he found himself reading her hands automatically. "Can you tell my mom I want the same pancakes? And can you teach her so she understands me without you?" The hope in those last words hit Garrett like a physical blow. "She wants the pancakes from last week." Garrett translated quietly. "And she's asking if I can teach you sign language so you can understand her without needing me to translate." He watched the words land, watched Cassandra's face crumple slightly before she caught herself. "Please," Cassandra said, and the word came out raw, stripped of pride or pretense. "I know I'm asking a lot, but I'm desperate. I'm watching my daughter grow up and I can't talk to her. Not really. Not the way she needs. And you can. You understood her in seconds, and I've been trying for 2 years. Garrett felt the walls around his heart protest, felt every instinct scream at him to refuse. But Ivy was watching him with those huge eyes. And in them, he saw Rosie. Saw every child who'd ever been silenced by a world that didn't know their language. He thought about the promise he'd made to his daughter. Maybe this was what she'd meant. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting. Maybe it meant using what you'd learned from loss to help others find what they needed. "I'm not a professional tutor," he said slowly, each word feeling like dismantling a brick from his wall. "I learned sign language from books and videos, from trial and error with my daughter. I don't have certificates or credentials." He paused, meeting Cassandra's eyes directly. "But if you're serious about learning, if you're willing to put in the work, I can try to help. Not for money. I don't want your money, but for Ivy, because every kid deserves to be understood by their parents." The relief that flooded Cassandra's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she breathed. "When can we start? I can work around your schedule, whatever you need." They settled on evenings after his shift ended, 3 times a week at Cassandra's penthouse downtown. The arrangement made Garrett deeply uncomfortable, but Cassandra insisted it would be easier to practice in her home where Ivy would be comfortable. The first session happened on Thursday evening. Garrett stood in the lobby of Cassandra's building, feeling profoundly out of place among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like ascending into another dimension. Cassandra answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair down around her shoulders. The penthouse was exactly what Garrett expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, furniture that probably cost more than his annual salary. Art on the walls that looked like it belonged in museums. But what caught his attention were the small signs of life scattered among the perfection. Ivy's drawings held to the fridge with magnets, a pile of shoes by the door, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. Evidence that people lived here. Ivy appeared from a hallway, her face lighting up when she saw Garrett. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the living room. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of hand shapes and repetition. Garrett started with basics, the alphabet and common words. He watched her struggle with the coordination, her analytical mind trying to categorize something that needed to become muscle memory. Ivy helped with infinite patience, showing her mother the correct hand positions over and over. Garrett saw how much the little girl wanted this to work. "You're thinking too hard," Garrett said gently. "It's not about getting it perfect. It's about communication. Ivy will understand what you mean even if your signs aren't textbook accurate." When Cassandra successfully signed "I love you" to Ivy, her daughter's response was overwhelming. Ivy threw herself into her mother's arms, signing the phrase back over and over, tears streaming down her face. Cassandra held her daughter tight, her own eyes wet, and Garrett had to look away. "She's been waiting to hear that from you," Garrett said quietly. waiting for you to say it in her language. Not just with words she can't hear. He saw understanding dawn on Cassandra's face, saw her realize how many times she'd probably said, "I love you," out loud, thinking it was enough. The sessions became routine. 3 times a week, Garrett arrived and spent 2 hours teaching Cassandra the language he'd learned for Rosie. It was harder than he'd expected, not the teaching, but the memories that came with it. Every sign brought back moments with his daughter. Sometimes he had to pause mid-lesson, overwhelmed by grief that still felt fresh. Cassandra never pushed, seemed to sense when he needed a moment. Ivy would sit beside him in companionable silence, her small hand occasionally patting his arm. Week by week, Cassandra improved. Her signs became more natural, less like she was translating in her head. One evening, about 6 weeks into their lessons, Ivy asked him directly. They were taking a break, Cassandra in the kitchen making tea. "Why are you so sad?" She signed. "When you teach us, sometimes your eyes look like you want to cry. Did someone hurt you?" Garrett's hands froze. He'd been careful, or so he thought. "I had a daughter," he signed slowly, each gesture feeling like pulling shards of glass from his chest. "She was like you. She couldn't speak with her voice, so we talked with our hands. I learned sign language for her." "Where is she now?" Ivy asked, and Garrett saw in her face that she already knew the answer. "Did she go to heaven?" Garrett nodded, not trusting himself to sign or speak. Ivy scooted closer, wrapping her small arms around him in a hug that reminded him so much of Rosie that he did start to cry then, silent tears that slid down his face. "I'm sorry your daughter died," Ivy signed when she pulled back. "But I think she would be happy you're teaching us, because now my mom understands me, and that makes me happy. Your daughter probably wants you to be happy too." Cassandra appeared in the doorway with tea, took one look at Garrett's face, and immediately understood something significant had happened. She sent Ivy to her room, then sat down beside Garrett. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked quietly. And somehow, sitting in this stranger's living room, Garrett found himself talking. Really talking, for the first time since Rosie's funeral. He told Cassandra about his daughter, about learning sign language from library books at 2 a.m. He told her about the years they'd had together, the profound connection of sharing a language most people didn't understand. And then he told her about the end, about Rosie's congenital heart condition, how they'd always known her time was limited, but somehow never believed it would actually run out. About the hospital room where she'd died in his arms while signing, "I love you, Daddy," with her last breath. About the 2 years since, where he'd existed rather than lived, keeping Rosie's language locked away because using it without her felt like betrayal. Cassandra listened without interruption, without offering platitudes. When he finally fell silent, she simply said, "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for doing this, even though it hurts." But moving forward meant opening himself up to complications he hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks later, everything changed. It started with a man at the door. Preston stood there in an expensive suit with an expensive watch and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. Cassandra's face went white when she saw him, and Ivy suddenly went still and small. "Preston," Cassandra said, her voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" Preston's eyes swept the room. "I'm here because my lawyer advised me it was time to revisit our custody arrangement. You're clearly too busy to properly care for Ivy." The casual cruelty of it, delivered in front of the child, made Garrett's hands curl into fists. Ivy's face had gone carefully blank. Cassandra's composure never cracked, but Garrett saw her hand tremble slightly. "We're not discussing this in front of her. Garrett, could you stay with Ivy?" The moment they were gone, Ivy's composure shattered. "Is he taking me away?" she signed, her hands shaking so badly the signs were barely legible. "I don't want to go with him. He doesn't know how to talk to me. He doesn't try." Garrett signed. "Your mum won't let that happen. She loves you more than anything." When Cassandra and Preston finally emerged, her face was ashen. Preston headed straight for the door. "See you in court, Cassandra. My lawyer will be in touch." The door slammed. Cassandra sank onto the couch, head in her hands. "He's filing for full custody," she said. "Claims I'm never here, that I'm neglecting Ivy by prioritizing work. And the worst part is, he's not entirely wrong. I have been absent. I've been trying to change, but the damage is done." She looked up at Garrett. "What am I going to do?" Garrett knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "You fight." The custody battle consumed the next 2 months. Preston's team was ruthless, painting Cassandra as an absent mother who cared more about her company than her child, presenting evidence of missed school events and parent-teacher conferences. Cassandra's lawyers wanted character witnesses. She asked Garrett to testify. His immediate instinct was to refuse. He was nobody, a waiter with no credentials. But then Ivy had pulled him aside, signing, "Please help my mom. You're the only one who really knows how hard she's trying." So Garrett agreed, even though the thought of standing up in court made his hands shake. The night before the custody hearing, Ivy disappeared. Cassandra called Garrett in a panic. But Garrett knew. He knew with a certainty that came from having been a parent to a child who couldn't shout when they were lost. He found her at Riverside Diner, sitting in the corner booth. Helen was sitting with her. Garrett slid into the booth across from Ivy. "I don't want to go with him." Ivy's hands finally moved, tears streaming down her face. "He doesn't understand me. He tries to make me normal. He wants me to get surgery so I can talk like everyone else." "I don't want to leave you either, Uncle Garrett. You're the only one who talks like me. You make me feel like being me is okay." The Uncle Garrett hit him like a freight train. He reached across the table, taking Ivy's trembling hands in his own. "Listen to me," he signed. "Your mom loves you exactly as you are. She's been learning your language not to change you, but to know you. And she's fighting for you tomorrow because she knows who you are is perfect. You don't need to be fixed or made normal. You're already everything you need to be." Over Ivy's head, Garrett saw Cassandra appear in the doorway. Cassandra's face crumpled when she saw them, saw her daughter seeking comfort from Garrett. But instead of jealousy, Garrett saw only gratitude. Cassandra approached slowly, and Garrett pulled back, giving Ivy space to see her mother. Cassandra knelt beside the booth, her hands beginning to move in sign language that was no longer clumsy or hesitant, but fluid and natural. "I'm sorry I scared you," she signed. "I'm sorry I haven't always been there, but I'm here now, and I'm fighting for you tomorrow." "Do you really want me?" Ivy signed back, the question simple but devastating. "Even though I can't talk normal? Even though I'm different?" And Cassandra's response, signed with tears streaming down her face, was everything Ivy needed to hear. "You're not different, baby. You're exactly who you're supposed to be. And I don't want you to change. I want to change. I want to be better for you, to understand you, to speak your language because your language is beautiful, and I want to share it with you." They held each other while Garrett watched, feeling like he was witnessing something sacred. The custody hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. Garrett arrived at the courthouse in the only suit he owned. He felt out of place among the lawyers, a blue-collar worker who had no business being involved in a custody dispute. But when he saw Ivy clutching her mother's hand, saw the fear in both their faces, he knew he belonged here. Not because of credentials, but because he'd been trusted with the truth of their relationship. Preston's lawyers went first, painting Cassandra as an absent workaholic who'd pawned off her daughter to hired help. They had documents and testimony that looked damning on paper. When Garrett's name was called, the energy in the courtroom shifted. He walked to the witness stand on legs that felt unsteady, raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. The lawyer started with easy questions. Garrett answered simply, honestly, explaining about the day Cassandra and Ivy had come into the diner. "And in your professional opinion as a sign language tutor," the lawyer asked, "how would you characterize Ms. Brooks's dedication to learning?" Garrett almost smiled. "I'm not a professional tutor," he said clearly. "I'm a waiter who learned sign language for my daughter who passed away 2 years ago. But I can tell you that in the months I've been working with Ms. Brooks, I've never seen anyone more dedicated. She practices constantly, shows up to every lesson, puts in the work, even when it's hard. She's not trying to change Ivy. She's changing herself to meet her daughter where she is." Preston's lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Walsh, isn't it true that you've formed an inappropriate attachment to Ivy as a replacement for your lost child? That your judgment about this situation is clouded by your own grief?" The question was designed to discredit him. Garrett met the lawyer's eyes and felt something settle in his chest. "Ivy isn't a replacement for my daughter," he said quietly. "Nobody could replace Rosie, but when I met Ivy, I saw a little girl who needed someone to understand her, and I had the skills to help. Not because she reminds me of my daughter, but because I remember what it felt like to be the parent who had to learn an entirely new language just to tell his child he loved her. Teaching Cassandra hasn't been about my grief. It's been about honoring what my daughter taught me. But the moment that changed everything came when the judge asked if Ivy herself wanted to speak." The courtroom fell silent as the small girl stood up, walking to the front with her mother beside her. Cassandra stepped forward with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to interpret for my daughter. She communicates through American Sign Language." What followed was 15 minutes that left not a dry eye in the courtroom. Ivy talked about how lonely she'd felt, about the frustration of being misunderstood, about her father's push for her to get surgery to be normal. And then Ivy signed something that made Preston's face go pale. "My dad loves me, but he doesn't love who I am. He wants me to be different. My mom loves who I am. She learned my language because she wanted to know me, not change me. I want to stay with my mom. Please don't make me leave her. Please." The simple plea, translated by Cassandra through tears, echoed in the silent courtroom. The judge called for a recess. 2 hours later, the judge returned with a decision. Custody would remain with Cassandra, with supervised visitation for Preston. Outside the courthouse, in the bright afternoon sun, Ivy threw her arms around Garrett's waist, signing thank you over and over with tears of relief. Cassandra stood beside them, and when Garrett met her eyes, he saw gratitude and something else. The weeks after the custody hearing settled into a new rhythm. Cassandra made good on her promises, stepping back from her role as CEO to become executive advisor. Garrett continued teaching sign language at a community center, classes twice a week for parents of deaf children. Cassandra had offered to fund the program. Word spread quickly, and soon his classes were full. On Tuesday mornings, Cassandra and Ivy still came to Riverside Diner, now regulars who had their own booth reserved. Garrett no longer served them, having been promoted to assistant manager, but he always made time to sit with them. 6 months after the hearing, the judge called them back for review. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The social worker presented a glowing report. Preston didn't contest the findings. He'd started learning sign language himself, showing up to visitations prepared to actually communicate with his daughter. The judge closed the case with a smile. Case closed. That evening, Garrett pulled out the photograph of Rosie that he'd carried in his pocket for 2 years. He looked at her gap-toothed smile, her hands frozen in their eternal "I love you," and felt the familiar ache of missing her. But underneath the grief was something new, something that felt almost like peace. He'd kept his promise. He hadn't been sad forever. He'd taken the language she'd taught him and used it to help others. He placed the photograph in a frame on his bedside table, where he could see it, but where it no longer needed to be hidden like a secret wound. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at the text Cassandra had sent. Ivy wants to know if you'll come to her school's sign language showcase next month. She's performing a poem about family. We'd both really like you to be there. Garrett typed his response. I'll be there. Wouldn't miss it. The showcase was held on a Thursday evening in late spring. Garrett arrived to find the place packed. Cassandra had saved him a seat in the front row. When Ivy took the stage, spotlit against the dark curtain, Garrett felt his breath catch. She performed a poem she'd written herself. It was about family, about the different ways people could love each other, about how understanding didn't require speaking the same first language as long as you were willing to learn. And as she signed the final line, her eyes found Garrett in the audience. The applause was thunderous. After the showcase, families mingled in the hallway. Garrett stood with Cassandra, watching Ivy show off her medal to her friends. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming to the diner that day, for giving me a reason to use what Rosie taught me. Cassandra turned to him. You gave me my daughter back, she said simply. They stood there in the crowded hallway, surrounded by noise and laughter and life, and Garrett felt something he thought he'd never feel again. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to bring back what was lost, but the gentle hope of someone ready to accept what was being offered. A chance to move forward, a chance to let new relationships grow without diminishing old love. Ivy ran over, signing excitedly. As the crowd thinned, Garrett walked Cassandra and Ivy to their car. The spring evening was warm and clear. Ivy climbed into the back seat, already drowsy from excitement. Cassandra paused with her hand on the car door. We're having dinner on Sunday, she said. Nothing fancy, just cooking at home. Ivy wants to try making that casserole from your diner. Would you like to join us? As a friend. As someone who's become important to us. The invitation hung in the air between them. Garrett could feel himself standing at a crossroads. He thought about Rosie, about the promise he'd made. He thought about the poem Ivy had just performed. He thought about his own journey from grief-paralyzed widower to someone who could teach and help and maybe live again. I'd like that, Garrett said, and felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. I'd like that very much. Cassandra's smile was bright enough to rival the streetlights. They made plans for Sunday, and as Garrett watched the Mercedes pull away, he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Anticipation for the future, curiosity about what came next. He walked back to his own car and looked up at the stars. I kept my promise, Rosie, he said quietly. I'm not sad forever, and I think you'd like them. I think you'd want me to let them in. Sunday dinner became a weekly tradition, then twice a week. It happened gradually, naturally, not a dramatic declaration, but a slow intertwining of lives and routines and affections. 6 months later, Helen pulled Garrett aside. You're different, she said. Lighter, like you finally figured out how to carry what you need to carry without letting it crush you. Garrett nodded. Rosie would be proud of you, Helen continued. Not because you've moved on, but because you've figured out how to move forward while still honoring her memory. That takes real courage. That evening, Garrett brought Ivy to visit Rosie's grave for the first time. They knelt beside the small headstone, and Garrett told Ivy stories about Rosie. Ivy listened with solemn attention, then turned to the headstone and signed, Thank you for teaching your daddy our language, because he taught my mummy, and now she understands me. You made my family better even though you're in heaven. I wish I could have met you. I think we would have been friends. Simple words, but they cracked something open in Garrett's chest. He cried then, and Ivy held his hand and just sat with him in his grief. When he finally stopped crying, he felt lighter than he had in years. A year after the custody hearing, the three of them stood in Riverside Diner at a small celebration. Garrett's sign language program had grown beyond expectations, now serving 5 locations across the city. Cassandra's company had implemented comprehensive accessibility programs, and Ivy had started a sign language club at her school. Helen had insisted on hosting the celebration, filling the diner with all the people whose lives had been touched, and in the corner booth by the window there was a small plaque, in memory of Garrett Walsh, who taught us that love speaks every language. As the celebration wound down, Garrett found himself back in that corner booth with Cassandra on one side and Ivy on the other. The spring sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought about all the mornings he'd spent here lost in grief. He thought about the day Cassandra and Ivy had walked in and cracked open his carefully constructed isolation. "Thank you," Cassandra signed, "for taking a chance on us." Garrett signed back. "Thank you for giving me a reason to use what Rosie taught me, for reminding me that grief doesn't have to be the end." Ivy added her own message. "And thank you both for learning my language. I don't feel alone anymore." The simple statement summarized everything perfectly. They'd found each other in their respective struggles and built something beautiful. Understanding, connection, family in the truest sense. As they left the diner that evening, Garrett turned back for one last look at the corner booth, at the plaque honoring Rosie's memory. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening. There would be more Tuesday mornings, more sign language classes, more dinners, more moments of building a life that honored the past while embracing the present. In the end, it came down to language, the language of grief and growth, of loss and love, of silence and understanding. It came down to the willingness to learn how others communicated, to meet them where they were, to bridge gaps that seemed insurmountable. Garrett had learned that language from Rosie. He'd taught it to Cassandra and Ivy, and together they'd created something that transcended words. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on the radical act of choosing to understand each other day after day, sign by sign, moment by precious moment. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen in complete silence.